Hello, I'm Kate Miller. I'm the Coordinator of Science and Partnerships for the Population Health Research Network, and this is the first of the PHRN's Linkage Learning webinar series for 2024. I'm presenting today from the University of Western Australia, whose campus is situated on Noongar land. Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. So I've been asked today to present on the development of the PHRN's Metadata platform, which was launched late last year. The final launch was the result of a 2-year project. So in today's presentation, I'll provide an overview of the project context, so how it came about that we embarked on this project, what approach we took to developing the metadata platform, what we identified as a problem here in Australia with the current state of metadata, what our vision was, and then the proposed solution. And then I'll go through some of the key features of the high fidelity prototype that we developed, and then finish off with our next steps. So to start off with, I just want to give a brief background of the Population Health Research Network for anyone who's joining us for the first time. So the PHRN was established in 2009 and it was implemented through the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy, which is an initiative of the Australian government. But it's a national network. It's comprised of several state-based data linkage units that serve each of the states and territories throughout Australia. We have a national data linkage unit, which is based out of the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, a national coordinating office, which is based here in Perth, and a secure remote access laboratory, which we refer to as SURE, that together support access to linked population data. So the metadata platform was initiated to support one of the PHRN's strategic objectives, which is to pursue innovative solutions to improve the efficiency of the application, the data linkage, extraction, and access processes. And then more broadly, to enhance, maintain, and develop data linkage infrastructure, which is what we're all about. So in Australia, the demand for linkage is increasing. Researchers, governments, policymakers, they really recognise the potential of linked data and the insights that you can gain from this kind of methodology. But the timelines at the moment to accessing data are longer than what we would like them to be. And so we recognise that change in the process is needed. And so the aim of the metadata project and where it fits as part of the solution was to try and facilitate researchers' access to linked data by firstly making metadata about routinely linked data collections more discoverable, and then secondly to try and make it easier for researchers to evaluate the utility of data collections for specific research requirements. So what is metadata and why is it important? So metadata is information that defines and describes data. So more precisely, it's the underlying definition or structured description of the content, quality, condition, or other characteristics of data. But it's a really critical component of our research infrastructure ecosystem. It can be used to enhance discoverability, to enhance the original data itself, and then importantly, to enable the user to make informed decisions about whether the data is fit for a required purpose. In Australia, the data collections, they're held by a range of different organisations, and the collation and the publication of metadata, it's usually completed by individual data custodians. So before we started this project, there were some known issues related to metadata. The first one was the difference in the quality and the completeness of metadata that's available across different data collections. So data linkage, by definition, involves the bringing together of data from 2 or more different sources, right? Data that relate to the same individual, family, place, or event. So researchers who are undertaking data linkage projects are often requesting the linkage of data collections that are managed by different data custodians, and then at times within different jurisdictions. And so the implication of this being that the nature and the detail of the metadata and the frequency with which it's updated and then made available to users can vary significantly between the data collections. So this can be due to things like funding or policy constraints, for example. But for any given research or linkage project, you can have 2 or more data collections where the quality, the completeness, or even the currency of the metadata for those 2 collections are vastly different. And so we went into this project knowing that there were data collections out there that had really high quality metadata, but we also knew that there were data collections out there that had quite limited metadata. And so one of the things that we wanted to achieve as part of this project was also to try and lift the quality of metadata across the board. The second issue is that, and it arises from multiple data custodians, I think, also being involved, is that the metadata isn't available at a single place. And so it can be difficult to access and evaluate. And whilst there might be a wealth of metadata that's available for data collections, the vast and the diverse data custodian landscape that's inherent in most of our data linkage projects means that finding the relevant information from multiple data collections can be a really arduous and time-intensive task for our researchers. Metadata is commonly spread across different websites and documents, and at the time there was no simple way for researchers to search through data collections. I think it's probably useful at this point to reflect that in Australia, when data linkage was first established, it was primarily focused on the linkage of health data. But over time, the importance of including data from other disciplines, I think, has been increasingly recognised. Linking data from multiple disciplines creates, these amazing opportunities for us to be able to better understand some of those more challenging and pressing societal issues, that really do require complex, detailed data from several different sectors. And so as a result, data linkage units, they now have extensive holdings of non-health data sets, such as your justice, family, education. Linkage units are also linking in important survey data. We have some clinical registries now. But that means now that we have researchers that are requesting a broader range of data collections across Australia. And I think as data linkage units continue to build their data linkage capacity in response to this researcher demand, the number of data collections that are routinely linked is really increasing. And so as a result, there really was a need for a centralised discovery platform that brings together all the data collections that are currently available for linkage across all jurisdictions into a single place. The aim of that is to try and maximise asset visibility, encourage standardisation in the way that metadata is presented for linked data collections. And then we're also interested in looking at providing a rating system for data quality and utility. The third issue is that it's resource intensive to support. So from a business process perspective, we have client services staff that sit in each of our data linkage units. And so their role is to support researchers who are undertaking data linkage research, primarily through supporting them through the application approval process. But importantly, they also act as a conduit between our researchers and our data custodians. And this latter role is important because the predominant scenario for most of our custodians, particularly of our administrative data sets, is that the provision of data for research is not part of their job description. It's not part of their key role. And so there's no dedicated resources for the preparation and the delivery of data to researchers, nor the development and preparation of metadata neither. So obviously for some collections, there are minimum metadata requirements, but it's limited if you compare it to the kind of metadata that would be needed by a researcher to inform decision-making with regards to its relevance or utility. And then further, it may be that it's not freely available or readily accessible either. So I think in acknowledging this, in an attempt to try and reduce the burden that data linkage research places on our data custodians, the client services play this important role in responding to researcher queries about data collections on behalf of the data custodians. But we've found that more often than not, the information that the researchers are requesting either already existed online or they've been shared numerous times with other researchers in the past. And this creates this unnecessary repetition and duplication, but it also reduces the capacity of client services staff to provide support for more complex matters. And so the PHRN sought funding for the Metadata Toolbox project in 2021. And the objectives of the project were to investigate the range of metadata methods and tools currently in use for evaluation of data sets using metadata, to scope international best practice and innovation in metadata for linked administrative and population level data, understand what Australian linked data researchers need to effectively explore and evaluate data collections, and to deliver a centralised discovery platform to facilitate the exploration and finding of linked data sets through an online data catalogue and accompanying metadata. In terms of the methodology that we used for this project, there were three quite distinct phases. So the first phase was an internal phase, which was a desktop review or a scoping exercise where we really sought to understand what the current state of metadata in Australia was. So what metadata is currently available, how is it collected and by whom, and then similarly, how is it managed and by whom, and then how is it made available to researchers and then used by researchers. And then within that, we also sought to try and identify where there are gaps. And then we looked internationally. We conducted a review of international best practice and innovation in metadata for linked administrative and population level data. And we looked to see if there are any existing metadata platforms internationally that we could use as a reference. And we found nationally that data linkage units themselves were publishing metadata on their websites at varying levels. So some data linkage units, they provided quite minimal metadata, whilst others had quite extensive metadata, including variable lists, data dictionaries, data quality reports, for example. The metadata is generally updated by client services on an annual basis in consultation with the data custodians. The PHRN themselves, we did have a listing of the core data collections on our website from each of the jurisdictions' data linkage units. So they're the routinely linked data collections, which are a part of the data linkage unit's master linkage file. So they include your collections such as your birth registry, perinatal, hospital, cancer, death registry, those types of things. But it was really provided with quite minimal metadata. So we had, a summary description of the data collection, the temporal range for which data was available, and the geographical coverage of the data, and that was about it. More broadly, so not limited to linked data collections, we have the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. So they've developed and they maintain the metadata online repository, which we know as Meteor. But that repository contains metadata standards for health, aged care, community services, early childhood, housing and homelessness sectors. But it operates as a metadata registry, which is really designed to support a more disciplined approach to the development, storage and management of metadata. It contains the national minimum dataset list, dataset specifications, and national data dictionary, but it's also got information around metadata standards. But at the moment, it doesn't have metadata for all the individual jurisdictional data collections, and it has a primary focus on metadata at a variable level rather than at the data collection itself. So I think if I were to summarise the findings from the national scoping exercise, there was no centralised point where researchers could easily search what data collections are available for linkage and the associated metadata. The completeness and the quality of the metadata varied significantly across collections and jurisdictions, and there was no standardisation in the way that metadata was presented. And so it's difficult for researchers to compare data collections and determine their utility for a specific research purpose. Internationally, we found a few metadata platforms that we were able to identify. And then once we had a really good idea of what metadata platforms were available, we then reached out to those organisations to discuss their processes. So Health Data Research UK, they were one of the organisations that we identified as having a searchable data catalogue that could potentially act as a model for Australia. So the HDR UK, they manage the UK Health Data Research Innovation Gateway. It was developed in 2020 as a common entry point or portal for researchers to be able to discover what data collections are available for research use. So the portal allows researchers to search for data sets via filters. So some of the filters that they had were keywords, phenotype, coverage, provenance, access, format standards, whether or not technical metadata was available. And then they also had this data utility framework filter. So HDR UK developed this data utility framework, which indicates the utility of a data set for researchers for a particular purpose based on a set of key attributes. And I have an example of it here. So as you can see, it has data documentation. So that considers things like documentation completeness, availability of data dictionaries and provenance. Technical quality, so that's completeness, uniqueness, accuracy, validity, timeliness, and consistency. Coverage, so both pathway and length of follow-up. Access and provision, so that considers dimensions such as allowable users, time lag and timeliness, and then value and interest, so that considers its ability to be able to link with other data sets. So we met with HDR UK to discuss, as I said, the process that they used to develop the platform. So we wanted to know whether there was a consultation process, how they went about engaging their end users, how the key features that were included were decided on, and then how the utility framework came about, and then how was it received by researchers, and what value practically has it had. We were also interested in any evaluation that they'd done that would indicate what attributes were most valued by researchers and any feedback on its functionality. We were just really keen to hear from them what some of the key learnings were with regards to not only the building of the metadata platform, but also the ongoing maintenance of it. I think it just made good sense for us to understand and incorporate any learnings from them into the work that we were doing. And they were incredibly gracious in the way that they shared information with us, and we're immensely grateful for the insight and the guidance that they provided, because these key learnings really did end up being quite instrumental to our next phase, and it really governed some of the decisions that we made. So by the end of the first phase, I think we had a really good idea of what metadata was available nationally, where the gaps were. We had some great examples of existing metadata platforms that were available internationally. And then also importantly, what some of the high value attributes were in each of those platforms, what some of the key challenges were in the development and the maintenance of these platforms, and then what were some of the key takeaway learnings from experience. So phase 2 of the project was then really about us testing the suitability of these practices in the Australian context, and then to design, prototype and validate our own version of a metadata toolbox. And so the vision was to develop a new metadata platform that enables researchers to more effectively evaluate the suitability of data sets across jurisdictions. And so we were guided by 3 main principles. So the first was to have streamlined features that allowed researchers to browse and evaluate data sets, to allow metadata to be comparable across all jurisdictions and data collections, and then for helpful information that's currently communicated to our researchers on that one-to-one basis to be made more available in a more systematic and sustainable way to our researchers. So the second phase included, I guess, 4 key strategies. So firstly, we did some foundation work to understand the current state and to define key opportunities for the metadata toolbox. We then did proposition design to test concepts and to understand what value researchers might see in the metadata toolbox and then how to best communicate that. We had experience design. So this was a cycle of prototype and testing to try and refine the digital experience for the metadata toolbox. And then finally, we had the roadmap. So this involved creating an actionable plan to deliver the metadata toolbox, which considered the priorities and the capabilities that were required to deliver on the experience, and then also the overall feasibility. So for the foundations piece of work, we worked with the consultancy firm Future Friendly to conduct a series of interviews with experts from various organisation jurisdictions to try and understand the current state of metadata in Australia, identify what some of the key pain points are in the data linkage process as it stands, and then to try and identify some key opportunities for the metadata toolbox. And then after these initial interviews, we then worked in collaboration with Future Friendly to develop a high fidelity prototype of the metadata platform. And so the initial platform that we designed and that was then presented was a modified version really of the HDR UK model that it included some early modifications based on what we heard from our conversations that we had with those international organisations that had already developed a data catalogue, the needs of our end users that we identified in those early expert interviews, and then some additional features to try and address some of the issues that in the business processes that we were experiencing internally. And so Future Friendly used these high fidelity prototype to test and validate the proposed design, the features that we'd included, and then the functionality of the platform itself. But the platform was tested in these one-on-one interviews, which were conducted via MS Teams with our client services, as well as researchers from each of the jurisdictions. But researchers through MS Teams, they were sent a link to the live prototype, and they were then asked to share their screen and then asked to navigate their way through the platform and to think aloud as they went. And this process was a really great way for us to get insight into what the researchers liked, what they didn't like, what they expected to see, what was missing, whether the platform was intuitive. And then we also got feedback as we went on the design and the features through this process as well. And we also used this to test the suitability of the HDR UK rating tool with Australian users in these sessions as well. So Future Friendly conducted 18 of these user testing sessions over a 5-week period. And then we made iterations to the prototype after each week of testing. The researchers that we interviewed, they had quite a diverse range of experience with linked data. And they also had quite a diverse range in the types of data collections that they'd use for research as well, which I think is quite useful. So by the end of the second phase, I think both Future Friendly and the PHRN Program Office had quite high confidence in the final solution, this high fidelity prototype, as we started to get really good saturation of ideas and feedback by the end of testing. So at the end of, at the completion of user testing, we then held a workshop with our data custodians of the routinely linked data collections to assess the platform for feasibility and acceptability, but also to try and gather any feedback and identify any risks as well. So going into phase 3, we had a standardized template for data collection metadata that was agreed on by researchers, client services and data custodians nationally. And we had a clear direction on the design and the functionality of the platform. And so phase 3 of the project essentially just involved the building and the implementation of the new metadata platform based on this high fidelity prototype, that we felt really confident was going to meet the needs of our end users. So in phase 3, we translated the high fidelity designs into an estimated roadmap to track development progress accurately. We decided on the most suitable technical approach, including the CMS and the hosting arrangements, taking into account PHRN stakeholder and end user needs. We then built and deployed the metadata platform to the internet, and then we held a virtual session to train staff on how to edit and manage the content in the back end to allow the PHRN to continue to manage the content. So phase 3 was completed over a 7-week period. So in terms of the key features of the metadata platform, the first one was searching, browsing and filtering. So from the home page, researchers expressed a need to both browse and search for data sets depending on what phase they were in their research project. So this could be as specific as looking for a particular variable, or as broad as looking as broad as browsing or perinatal data sets. Within the platform itself, as you can see here, there are a range of different filters that are available to researchers based on characteristics such as jurisdiction, collection type, linkable data range, and resources that are available. So the standardized format for the way in which metadata is presented for data collections was a really important feature of the program. So we started with the high value attributes, which were identified in that initial scoping exercise that we conducted with HDR UK. And then we qualified that list with our end user interviews. And that resulted in some attributes being added and then a few that were seen as redundant being removed. And then once we had our final list, we worked really closely with the Office of the National Data Commissioner to align the attribute names and then the underlying definitions with the core metadata attributes for data inventories, which was developed through the Australia Data Champions Network. But prior to the development of the platform, there were some real variations in the data collections, across the data collections and the jurisdictions in the attributes that were collected and the information that was provided on the data collections. And so to get national agreement on the attributes that would be included and to be able to present metadata in a consistent format, no matter which data collection or researcher was viewing, I think was a real achievement. We heard from our researchers in concept testing that this consistent approach would enable them to quickly compare and evaluate data sets, and that presenting the information in the same way would save them from trying to learn the different metadata standards and formats that are used by different custodians and jurisdictions. So also from our perspective, I should say, this template also encouraged data custodians to enrich their existing metadata and their documentation to better meet the needs of our researchers. So for each data collection, we have information on the temporal range of both the asset and the linked data, the update frequency of both the collection and the linkage, and when the metadata was last updated. And then we have this equivalent data sets attribute as well. So most of these are self-explanatory, but the equivalent data sets is particularly important for our cross and multi-jurisdiction projects. So cross-jurisdiction linkage is necessary in Australia because our federal, state and territory governments hold different data. So for example, we don't hold Medicare data at a state level. But it's also important because the Australian population is mobile. So they move across borders and they access services in different jurisdictions, particularly in areas where you have a high population close to the border, such as the New South Wales, Queensland border, for example. So cross-jurisdiction linkage allows us to track people moving across borders for different services in different states. The other reason is that sometimes we just need big numbers for research, or a particular disease is rare and we don't have enough people in a single state to adequately answer the research question that we have. And so this attribute here allows the researchers to see what other jurisdictions have equivalent data collections available for these cross or multi-jurisdiction projects. So the rest of the About page, under the summary, we have a descriptive statement of the asset, its scope, limitations, purpose. There's also in there geographical coverage, legal authority, access rights, language, format, and coding. So the documentation tab, so this provides links to variable lists, data dictionaries, data quality statements, and any other relevant documentation when they're available. It was really clear throughout our consultations that pointing to the original source as a single source of truth, if you like, was preferred, rather than providing the documents within the platform itself. So the platform points to the original source in the first instance where possible. But for those data collections where the documentation isn't publicly available, either through the data linkage unit's website or the data custodian's organisational website, we'll host the document in the platform. And that allows us to provide access to documentation that wouldn't otherwise be available. So the FAQs, so this feature aims to make the information that's currently communicated to researchers on that one-to-one basis available to all researchers. So the FAQs provides a space for client services staff and data custodians to publish answers to the commonly asked questions that they receive from researchers to try and make that useful information more readily available, and also to try and reduce the demands on client services staff related to those low-level queries. The publications tab, so that allows researchers to view any journal articles, reports or presentations that relate to the linkage of that particular data set. So this is really useful to enable researchers to learn about how the data is being used in research. So the ability to reach out and contact a researcher that's already worked with your data set was seen as being invaluable to researchers, particularly for information about any shortcomings or issues that they might have experienced with the collection. I think it was also recognised that increasing the discoverability of linked data publications would help to reduce duplication of research, and then also to provide opportunities for better collaboration between researchers, which you'd hope would ultimately improve future research as well. So from the interviews, we learnt that researchers wanted ready access to contact details for single and cross-jurisdiction projects. We also have information here around the approvals that are required for accessing data as well as for publication. And then under data custodian, you can see here that we have position, organisation, email address for the data custodian of this collection. But you'll find once you're in there that for most of the data assets, it's just the position in the organisation. There was definitely a general reluctance in our interviews with both client services and data custodians to provide the actual contact details for the custodians. And I think that this was largely to limit the direct contact between researchers and custodians and rather encourage the use of client services to act as that conduit between the two parties, at least in the first instance. So in terms of insight, so the initial proposal, as I mentioned earlier, for this project included a rating system for data quality and utility. And so we tested the acceptability of that HDR UK data utility framework during phase 2 of the project. But it received quite limited support even after we'd made several modifications. So it was eventually removed from scope. And what we heard from researchers is that it would be much more preferable if the metadata platform just provided specific pieces of metadata that would support them in making their own judicious assessments of target data collections using the lens of their specific research question, rather than providing this quantitative rating system. Critical metadata that researchers said that would be useful included the data dictionaries, the data quality reports, variable level metadata, as well as mock data, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So in terms of impact, our testing sessions with researchers suggested that a new metadata platform would result in more confident researchers, more time for guidance, and significant time savings. So in terms of next steps, the platform is now live and it's fully functioning. We do have a few collections from one of the jurisdictions that has some missing data on several attributes. So this is a really key priority for us to try and get high quality and complete metadata for each of the collections that are included in the metadata platform. But outside of that, we do have, I think, 3 clear areas of work that we'd like to focus on in the near future. The first is to extend the holdings that we have within the platform. So when we first set out to do this project, we really focused on the data collections that were part of the data linkage unit's master linkage file, so those that are routinely linked. But we did a review at the back end of last year where we looked at what the most used data collections for linkage studies were, and it showed us that there were several non-core data collections that were actually used by researchers more commonly than some of our routinely collected data sets. And for the most part, these collections are not only highly valued by researchers, but they also contain high quality data. And whilst they're not routinely linked per se, there were often existing agreements with data custodians already in place. And so we're really interested in working with these custodians of these collections to try and expand the metadata platform to include these frequently linked non-core data collections to try and help us increase the asset visibility of these and a greater range of data collections that can be readily used for data linkage projects. The second recommendation is to investigate options to include mock data for routinely linked data collections is a key feature of the metadata platform. So the idea of providing mock data or sample data came out of our initial interviews, and then in testing, the availability of mock data ended up being one of the most valued features of the high fidelity prototype for researchers. But when we ran our data custodian workshops, there were some concerns around feasibility, specifically for the first release of the platform. So it wasn't that it wasn't possible, it was more that providing the data within the project timeframe was going to be challenging. So the feature was presented in testing in two formats. So there was a raw data extract, which you can see on the top left there. So that shows the researcher what they can expect to see once their data request is fulfilled. So this was in response to what we heard from researchers who are undertaking data linkage projects for the first time, which was that they were completely unprepared for what the data was going to look like when they got it. And so the thought was that by providing this mock data in this format, those who are new to data linkage could use it to judge what type of upskilling in statistical analysis they might need to be able to format or manipulate the data, or alternatively give them the opportunity to secure a programming resource before the extract is delivered. So the second format in the bottom right, this was a structured Excel spreadsheet really that clearly identifies column headers with variable names and short names, together with several lines of mock data as examples of how the data is formatted and coded. But our experienced researchers really expected to save significant time by being able to work on scripts ahead of receiving their extract. So both formats were really expected to deliver quite significant value for our researchers. So the last recommendation is to consider introducing persistent identifiers such as DOIs to precisely identify data collections. So one thing that we know is a priority nationally is the introduction of persistent identifiers for data collections, among other things. But this is something that the PHRN will be contributing to by having persistent identifiers for the data collections that are included in the platform. So this will allow us to accommodate for name changes to data collections, which happens more than you would expect, but it also helps us to better track outputs, particularly for publications resulting from linked data projects. So at the moment, we record the publications through data linkage studies that use the PHRN infrastructure manually. And this can be quite a tedious task, particularly when the name of the collections can change over time. I should say one other, I guess, next step, it's not listed here, but in terms of moving forward, I think we really need to consider how we can best maintain this platform and look to identify opportunities for the updates to be more systematic than what it is now, or even automated. I think the relevance of this platform is largely hinged on it being up to date. And so if we have temporal ranges, for example, that aren't current, or documents that are out of date, I think it will impact considerably on the usefulness of this platform as a resource that researchers can rely on. So there's a lot of work that's happening in that space right now, and that will help us to guide us. So I just want to finish with some acknowledgements. Future Friendly, so they conducted the consultations, they collaborated with us to develop, plan and build the metadata platform. We had an incredible project control group who really did provide excellent insight and support and guidance to the project, and really underpinned, I think, the success of the final product. And then to the data users and experts who participated in the expert interviews and the concept testing. So I've got a link here to the metadata platform and our usual contact details, and then just a quick plug for the new online researcher training that the PHRN just launched last month. So this has been designed for those who are new to data linkage, that want to have a better understanding of what kind of collections that are involved, what some of the benefits and disadvantages of administrative data are, how the linkage process works, and to navigate the application and approval process a little easier. So go and check it out if you're new to linkage. Thank you so much.